Hello again. It is time for another edition of Doctor and the Dude. I'm Dr. Jim Siebert, and joining me is my bestie, Josh Morganman. Josh, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Dr. Jim. Great to be back with you. Ready to talk hurricanes again.
We love it. Okay, now let's talk. We're going to talk about something that's a little bit different in that a lot of people may not realize, but we're going to talk about something that is a real danger. And I want you to just lead out with us and tell us what we're talking about.
Yep, I talk about this every conference I go to around hurricane safety. I talk about cars. Do not drive around in a car in a hurricane. I can't emphasize this enough. And I've seen every grisly outcome from that. When you're in a car in a hurricane, it can get buried by falling debris. For example, if it's parked next to a building, okay, it can get flipped or thrown around by the winds like it's a toy, or it can get penetrated by flying debris. For example, two by fours going through the windshield. I saw that in the eye of Hurricane Michael. As the calm eye passed over, I saw a two by four that had gone right through the driver's side windshield. If someone had been sitting there, they'd be dead. It doesn't matter if the car is parked or driving. Cars are like the worst place to be in hurricane winds. Okay,
So,
now that's just the winds. I know that you coming from Metro Houston, you know better than anybody the impact of water on cars.
Oh yeah, water is a whole different issue as well, and that we all learned. We've learned always from many storms, but Hurricane Harvey and what was then Tropical Storm Harvey in the Houston area was a really bad example. I mean, we lost over 500,000 cars just due to that flooding. Now, this is one of those situations too, Josh, where a lot of people did the right thing. You know, they weren't driving around; they were where they should be, but they still lost their cars. Now, how often do you see that where people have done the right thing and then it still turns out to have a kind of a bad outcome? Do you see that a lot?
Yeah, that's the biggest bummer because you feel like people should be rewarded by the universe for making wise choices. But that's the deal with hurricanes. It's always a little bit of a crapshoot. You never know exactly what's going to happen for sure. They're kind of chaotic beasts by nature.
Well, and one of the things we've learned too is that when you are driving around in your car, besides the things you were talking about with the flooding, though, a lot of those fatalities come when they drive into that floodwater, and it just happens way too often.
Yeah, yeah. Folks need to know if you can't see the stripes under the water, don't go in it.
That's some pretty good advice. All right, let's talk about some things are happening. Hurricane season's getting started now in the Eastern Pacific. Obviously, gets started a couple of weeks earlier than the rest of the Atlantic hurricane basin. So you've been tracking something already that is kind of looking a little organized.
Yeah, the computer models now are insistent that there's going to be a hurricane forming below the south coast of Mexico in the eastern Pacific. And the models are insistent. Now, last week I got faked out by the GFS. It suggested there was going to be a hurricane in the Gulf. Nothing happened. So I'm kind of like, sort of being a little more cautious in terms of looking at this one. However, there's good model agreement across the models that something's going to happen. And there's a very good chance I'm going to be down there in a couple of days to cover it. If it does become a hurricane, it'll be named Agatha.
Now, you mentioned something very important that there was model agreement. And when we start to see the models saying the same sorts of things, maybe some minor differences, but when they're all kind of saying that, yes, this looks like it's going to become tropical in nature, that's when my confidence starts to rise. And you mentioned that possible low that we were looking at about a week or two ago, also possibly in the Gulf of Mexico. The GFS was saying it, and then it just disappeared. Well, yeah, that's the kind of thing we look for this time of year. But Agatha is different in this case, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. The thing I look for as someone who hunts these things is model agreement, and that's what makes me kind of more confident about this one. Okay, if the GFS and the Euro and the hurricane models, the HWRF and the HMON, are all saying there's going to be a hurricane moving into the south coast of Mexico, I got to start taking that seriously, even though there's not even a low center yet.
Yeah, that's the hard thing is, right? We're playing with something that hasn't even formed. Now, what will be the key that makes you decide we're on this storm, we're going after it?
Ah, it's a really good question. This is one where I might make the decision to go a little early because there's such intense model agreement, meaning even before there's actually a defined low. That would be a little earlier than usual for me, but I want to get a jump on this potential first impact of the season.
And what's interesting is that this one looks like it could go from the Pacific and actually come into the Gulf of Mexico. You've been seeing that as well?
Yep, and I was going to actually ask you about that, Dr. Jim, because I know that some folks on Twitter have been asking me, is this going to do one of those weird things where it goes into the Gulf and becomes an Atlantic storm? What are your thoughts around that?
Well, it's definitely a possibility. I mean, we're at that point in the season now that anything that goes into the Gulf of Mexico that is a low does have that chance to become tropical in nature. Now, what impacts does that mean? Right now, it's way too early to say. But if there's a low in the Gulf, we would expect to see at least elevated tides from the Gulf Coast, from Texas to all the way to Florida. And then, of course, how close it gets to landfall, or if that were to happen, that's where we'd start to see some differences. But so right now, Josh, it looks like we're just kind of playing the waiting game.
Yep, you and me both, but I got to make a decision pretty fast with this one. So hopefully, if everything goes according to plan, Weather Nation viewers will be able to get my live coverage from way down in Oaxaca, the southernmost state of Mexico.
And when you go to follow a storm like this, you actually are looking to get right where the landfall is going to be. Isn't that correct? Not on the sides. You want to get right in the middle.
Exactly. Want to get right in that eye. One of my biggest thrills in hurricanes is collecting high quality air pressure data in the center that really helps scientists understand how strong it is. And in a lot of these areas, especially along the west coast of Mexico, there are not a lot of weather stations. So getting in that eye, getting a pressure reading is very valuable.
And for me, my highlight is to avoid the hurricane altogether. I'll be honest with you. But you are a brave man, and we're going to have some interesting couple of days. And so, of course, we'll have more about this coming up next week. But that's going to wrap up our time for today. So, Josh, we wish you luck on what happens with the storms. We'll watch it together, and we'll see you all next time.